The difference between Shaul HaMelech and King David was very simple. Shaul was a perfect human being. He was a tzaddik. David was an imperfect individual. And let's take a look at King David's lineage. I'm going to bring out what you said, but I'm going to bring it out in a long way to explain. And this goes to King David's whole history. Look at King David's yichus. And this is also the part where I want to talk about Mashiach. Where does the Messiah come from? Where does Mashiach come from? His lineage. You would think that Mashiach's lineage, he comes from the greatest line of rabbis that there are. That his father and his grandfather, his great-grandfather were the greatest rabbis in the history of the universe, all the way back to Abraham. That's what you would think. And we will talk about it now, how Mashiach's lineage and King David's lineage comes from murky depths. Starting with the story, the first story about Mashiach is what? When? Which story? Who?
Lot and his daughters?
The story of Lot and his daughters, right? Everyone familiar with Lot and his daughters, yes? In brief, just to refresh your memories, Lot was a person who escaped the inferno of Sodom and Amorah, and his daughters thought that he was the only person alive, and they slept with him. The first daughter slept with her father, and she named the child Moav, which means Me'av, which means from my father. That is where Messiah comes from at his roots. That is where King David comes from at his roots. The next stage of that is, anybody? Who?
Judah and Tamar.
Yehuda and Tamar. Yeah. The story of Yehuda and Tamar, which means basically that Yehuda, the fourth son of Yaakov, he thought he was sleeping with a prostitute on the road, and it turns out that it was his daughter-in-law Tamar, and he made her pregnant. He didn't know that. He thought he was sleeping with somebody else, and then he was embarrassed when he couldn't find her the next day. And 3 months later, rumor has spread in town that Tamar is pregnant, and Yehuda has no idea who it's from. So he says, let her be killed because she's basically tied down to a man. And as she's being sentence is being carried out, she's being burnt alive. Right before, she sends a message to Yehuda, the person who impregnated me is the owner of this signet ring, which was Yehuda, and Yehuda realized that he is the father and she's correct, and he stopped the execution. He married her and he had children with her, and that's how Peretz and Zerach were born, the forebearers of the Messiah. The next story, which I want to focus on now, is, some of you said it, is
Naomi and
the whole story of Ruth and Boaz. So let's just recap the story quickly, because I want to get into it as well. There was a man in Israel, Megillat Ruth tells us, living in Israel, by the name of Elimelech. He was married to a woman by the name of Naomi, and he had 2 sons by the name of, come on, very good, Machlon and Kilion. And there was a famine in Israel, and this man didn't want people to ask him for his money, so he went to Moav, which is like Jordan today. He went to live there, and the sons married the daughters of the king, Eglon, which the prophet Ehud later on in his life killed him. He was a very fat man, the Talmud says, and he killed a whole story. Anyways, Machlon and Kilion married Orpah and Ruth. God was angry with Elimelech for doing this, so that all the males in the family died, right? Elimelech, Machlon, Kilion, they all died. And Naomi was left with her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And she tells them, you guys stay here, and I will go back to my people. Orpah says, okay. She was the great-grandmother of Esti. Come on. Anybody?
Wait, who?
Orpah was the great-grandmother of who? Zalman of who? Very good, Zalman. Of Goliath. The great-grandmother of Goliath, the one who stood against King David. Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David, which means that David and Goliath were, was it 4th cousins or 3rd cousins? Whatever that is, right? So Ruth decided to stick with Naomi. Orpah stayed behind. Ruth then goes into Israel, and if we have time, we'll get more into the story, but the brief details are, Ruth goes into Israel, and and the leader of Israel, the king, the greatest rabbi in Israel, is a man by the name of Boaz. Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night and there's a woman at his legs. It was Ruth. Right? She was a distant relative. Anyway, Boaz marries Ruth. And the morning after the wedding, what happens to Boaz? He dies. He wakes up dead. So the Jews on the WhatsApp status, they had a status called Boaz. They were all talking about Boaz and they said, you know why God killed him? You know why? Because he married Ruth. He wasn't allowed to marry Ruth. Why wasn't he allowed to marry Ruth?
She's from Moav.
Because the Torah says you're not allowed to marry a Moavi convert for 3 generations. So the rabble rousers said, and by the way, there were big rabbis who said, that's why God killed him, because the leader of the Jewish people, he died as soon as he married Ruth. Why would God kill him? But he made Ruth pregnant. And Ruth gave birth to a child by the name of? Nope.
David's father.
Grandfather. A man by the name of Oved. Oved means servant of Hashem. He served God. He was a great tzaddik. Oved had a child by the name of Yishai. Yishai was one of 4 people that never sinned. There were 4 people, the Talmud said, that never ever sinned. And the only reason why they died was because Adam sinned. The first sin, the tree of knowledge, Adam sinned. That's why they died. By the way, what are their names? Come on, guys, you should know this. Number 1? No.
No?
The 4 people who never sinned, the Talmud says, are
Binyamin?
very good. Yoni gets the first point. Binyamin, the son of Jacob. Number 2. Who? No. Number 2 was a man by the name of
Enoch?
Yishai, the father of King David. Number 3, Kilav, the son of King David. And number 4, Amram, the father of Moshe Rabbeinu. These 4 people never sinned. They only died because Adam Rishon sinned. Now, where does it say this? The Talmud. If you want the exact source, I don't remember the exact page, but we can put it in ChatGPT, and ChatGPT will tell you in a second. But let's go back for a second. So where was I? So Boaz, they said, you know why he died? Because because he married a Moavi convert. Now, listen to this story. This is, if you're phasing out till now, phase back in. Is it interesting so far? So far, so good?
Yeah.
What happened now is Yishai had 7 children, right? 7 sons. They were in the army of Shaul HaMelech. Yishai wakes up one morning after he had 7 sons, and he was married to a woman by the name of Nitzevet. He's married to a woman by the name of Nitzevet, and he says to Nitzevet, I can no longer be with you. She's like, what? Why not? I'm sorry, I can no longer be with you. Why? Because my grandfather, remember my grandfather? My father was Oved, my grandfather was Boaz, the leader of the Jewish people. You remember the people who said that he died the morning after because he wasn't allowed to marry a Moavi convert? Well, maybe they're right. And if my grandfather wasn't allowed to marry a Moavi convert, that means the child born Oved was of inferior lineage, which means that I am of inferior lineage, which means that I cannot be with you. Because you are a pure Jewess. And you're not allowed to marry somebody of tainted lineage, somebody whose grandfather wasn't allowed to marry Ruth. So he said, I'm sorry, I can't be with you. And then he went to his maidservant. Don't know her name because it doesn't say her name. And he told his maidservant, or Tal, you know this?
Yeah.
Oh, you know this whole story.
You said it one time.
Oh, all right, great that you listen.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I like this, I remember it.
Okay, good. So he went and he told. By the way, this wasn't supposed to be the shir tonight. I'm like digressing here because I enjoy
It's a good
these
story.
stories.
It's worth it.
So he went to his maidservant and he told her, listen to me, my friend. I want to establish a child that's kosher. Glatt kosher. So I'm going to write a bill of divorce. Divorce meaning releasing you of your maidservant status. And I'm going to write like a legal stipulation. He was the greatest rabbi in town, by the way. As I said, he never sinned in his life, so he knew how to write these documents. And he said like this: if Boaz was not allowed to marry Ruth, that means my father was of inferior lineage. That means I am of inferior lineage. Then you are not free. You are a maidservant of inferior lineage. I am a guy of inferior lineage. Together we will have a child of inferior lineage. Fantastic. But if my grandfather was allowed to be with Ruth, because the Torah says you're not allowed to marry a Moavi convert in the male sense. But a female convert, you are allowed to. That means my father was a good Jew. Me, I'm a good Jew. So then I am releasing you, and you are free to be a maidservant, and you are a good, pure Jewess. Together we will have a child. It's a pure, good Jewish child. This was his plan. Good plan? The problem with the plan was... By the way, this is a big problem, because the truth is that Boaz was allowed to be with Ruth because she was a female Moavi convert, and the Torah says only male convert, but it was a big argument in those days. Anyway, the maidservant realized something's off with this guy, Yishai. He's too frum, he's too religious. So she went and told the plan to his wife, Nitzevet. And she said, on the night of the wedding, switch places with me. In other words, Yishai went under the chuppah with a woman who he thought was his maidservant. But really, the person there... Actually, it wasn't the chuppah, I'm sorry, it was in the bed already, because he didn't need to marry... He was already married to his wife. It was in the bed. She just switched places in the bed. In the bed, when she was there, simply Nitzevet went into the bed, and he had relations with her, and he made her pregnant. And when she became pregnant 3 months later, her sons were very, very angry, because everybody knew that Yishai had separated from his wife, which meant only one thing: she had betrayed her husband. They were very angry at her. Her husband was furious. When the child was born, they called him David. He was redhead, different to the other boys, different personality, different charisma. And they prayed to God that he be killed by a lion or by a wolf, and they made him a shepherd far away from them. Anytime something went wrong, they blamed David. This is how David was born. Out of this whole inferior kind of thing, that with a background. Right? This was his lineage. And this is where Mashiach comes from. By the way, just to answer the question, why is Messiah from this inferior lineage? Because the whole idea of Mashiach, of Messiah, is coming to purify the world. He's coming to make the world a better place, and therefore at his source, he needs to be of inferior lineage so that he can adapt to the world and fix this inferior world. But getting back to King David, so his lineage was, by the way, till 27 years old. David only lived till 70, till 27 years old. Everybody thought that he was a mamzer. If you look at chapter 69 of Tehillim, it says, Mamzer hayiti livnei chai, I was a bastard to my brothers. He says, I have more enemies than the hair on my head. I had so many enemies. Everybody hated me. Can you imagine the poor guy needed so much therapy, trauma, psychedelic workshops. Poor guy. But this was King David, and this is what the Talmud says. This is what made King David into a king of Israel.